Thanks so much for finding us here at the Morning Glory Project. I'm your host, Betsy Graziani Fassbender, and my co-producer, Angela Washington, and I are ever so proud and honored to bring the stories of amazing people to you. These are survivors, thrivers, innovators, and trailblazers who tell us not just their stories, but how they got through whatever they got through to get to where they are. We hope you find them as inspiring as we do. Thanks so much for listening and for giving us the honor of your time. It is my delight today to welcome to the Morning Glory Project, Caroline Leavitt. Caroline's mother told her that all of the Leavitt women were cursed with tragic lives. And at first, this seemed true. Caroline's young fiancé died in her arms from a heart attack 2 weeks before their wedding. She was in a coma in the hospital for months with a mysterious critical illness no one thought she would survive. And later, after success as an author, her writing career was shattered, making it seem that she would never be published again. But Caroline refused to let despair break her. Instead, she persisted with hope and resilience, knowing that sometimes the biggest tragedies can make future happiness even brighter. She ignored setbacks to become the New York Times bestselling novelist that she is, and ignored statistics to marry and have a child in her 40s. And she became a part of a wonderful community by helping writers during the pandemic lockdown, by cofounding A Mighty Blaze. Caroline is a New York Times bestselling author of 13 novels. Her most recent, my recent acquisition and delight, Days of Wonder. And I just finished this book, Caroline, last week. And I feel like you've been sitting on my shoulder, of course, as I prepare for my conversation with you. And I'll tell listeners that though Caroline is a bestselling author many times over, she is a new discovery for me, and that we became acquainted through another Morning Glory Project guest, Leah Lax, who is an utter delight. And when Leah says, you need to talk to somebody, I talk to that somebody. And that somebody brought me this delightful woman into my life. Welcome, Caroline, to the Morning Glory Project.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here talking with you.
Well, Caroline, when you have a mom that says, the women in our family have a curse, first of all, how in the world does that land? And what do you think she meant by that?
My mother did believe that the women in the family had a curse, and it took me a long time to realize that it was important for her and for my older sister to believe that, because it sort of relieved them of the fear of change, of having to do something about it. It was more like misery loves company. And it was I heard this from the time I was little, and it was a really hard way to grow up. My mother and my sister used to tell me anytime I was nervous about something, even if it was gym class, they would say, well, think about the worst thing that could happen to you, because no matter what happens, it won't be as bad as that. And if something bad happened, I would hear, well, of course that happened. This happens in our family. Or I would hear from my mother, isn't it funny how we all have failures in romance or whatever else. It was sort of a message that was drummed into me. And I saw how angry my mother was about her life and how unhappy my sister was about her life. And I just sort of determined early on, I have to find a way not to be this way. And it was very difficult for me because, I love my mom, I love my sister. And I thought, well, how am I going to get out of this? And the first thing that I did is whenever they would give me a message like that, I would try to counter it.
In your mind?
In my mind. No, out loud too.
And
I would tell.
Too?
Yeah, when my mother would say, well, no wonder you didn't get that part in the school play. Nobody looks the way you do, and nobody wants to see you on stage. And I would say, well, that's not true. And or I would come up with some reason why I didn't get the play. And I began to be known as the Pollyanna in the family, which was said with a great deal of derision. Like
you just don't get it. You don't get it.
You don't just get it. I mean, if my mother had a headache, it was a brain tumor. And I would always say, well, maybe you should go to the doctor. Maybe it's just a headache. And I would get slammed down. Or if my sister, there was always a phrase, of course, this always happens to us, or leave it to us, or with our luck. And I would always say, well, I don't have luck like that. And I would get slammed down. So it took me a whole lot of years to figure out that they were wrong.
It fascinates me, Caroline, because I'm kind of hearing this in two ways, this message from your mom and your family at large. One is kind of a kind, I think, and merciful way that you phrase it, which is, it seems like she was trying to protect you from disappointment. Like, if you see it as an of course, then it's not as shattering, right? Or in theory.
Right.
This is on paper. I'm not saying it works out that way, but I wonder if there was a kind of self-protective thing that she was doing, protecting herself against bad news and
Yes.
wanting you to. So there wasn't evil attached to her saying that thing.
No. It wasn't evil. I mean, my mother and my sister both loved me. It was just the kind of love that they gave me was not what I needed.
Right.
I needed somebody to tell me, go out, be brave.
You can
Instead
do
of,
it.
this is the worst thing that's happening. I needed somebody to say, well, think about what could be the best thing that might happen if you tried that.
Well, so that's part of sort of the other part of what I was thinking. So the first part is that they were in their own way protecting themselves from tragic
Yes.
news and trying to bring you into that umbrella of protection too. So that's a misguided but good motivation.
Yes.
But the other part of it is that it's about their outlook, that they really believed that this darkness was the fate, that things really are going to work out as crappily, that's a word, as crappily as they possibly can, that one should be prepared for the worst because that's likely going to be what would happen. And if it is the worst that happens, it's not the very worst that could happen. So lucky us, woohoo, right?
Right.
So in one hand, it's an understandingly maternal instinct to protect you, but on the other hand, it's this, the word may not be apt, but kind of a cynical, dark way of looking at the world.
It is a dark way of looking at the world, and it is cynical. And the interesting thing is that when things did get bad for me, if I had something happen in school and I came home crying, my mother and sister would be great. It was kind of, they understood that more than they did if I would come home and say, look, I won this prize or whatever. Their reaction would be very different because I think that was a state that they understood, and they understood what they could do about it, which was to be comforting and loving.
Well, and they also weren't then, their myth wasn't getting busted up by your good news.
That's right.
And I also, I have a phrase that I'm not necessarily proud that I have, but I do, because I have had in my acquaintance over the years, I have beautiful friends in lots and lots of ways, but I've had a couple of friends that I call foul weather friends, which is like, they're more comfortable with me when we're both going through crappy stuff.
Right.
Whereas when I'm successful or happy or things are going well, then there's this comparison that happens, like, why you, not me?
Right.
It changes the elevation of us in the relationship. We're hierarchical as opposed to peers. So if we can be foul weather friends, and I wonder if you see that there was kind of we're all in this together as long as things are going badly.
I think so. I mean, that was the bond. I mean, my mother and sister were very much like girlfriends in that they told each other everything, and they were very, very tight. And they liked that tightness because it was us against the world. It was, if I feel sorrow, you feel sorrow. And I just felt uncomfortable with that.
So then, I mean, of course, bad things do happen to us. They happen to everyone in life. And sometimes a series of very, very bad things happen to lots and lots of us. And some very, very bad things happened to you.
Yes.
And so I don't want to pretend like that wasn't the case or like it wasn't extra tragic, because it certainly was. But in your family's view, it'd be sort of like, well, of course, that's just how we are.
Right.
And by the way, you can expect way more of that, is this subtext, right?
Right.
So tell me, first of all, as you listed, the first of the tragedies that you list is the death of your fiancé, and which I can only here you were young, how you were 28.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about that in that moment.
It was really surprising and terrible and unexpected. And he just had a congenital glitch in his heart, and he died almost immediately. And when it happened, I was completely stunned. I felt like somebody had taken the edge of the universe and ripped it open, and now I saw that everything was different, and I didn't know what to do. And my mother wanted me to come and stay with her. My sister didn't know how to deal with it, actually. And my friends I had a lot of friends, and they were very loving and around me. And I knew I had to figure out a way to deal with this. And what I did is I took, we had saved like $25,000 or something to put a down payment on a condo or an apartment. And I took that money and I decided I was going to go across the country and visit friends, just to try to think, how am I supposed to do this? And my mother was very much against it. A lot of my friends were supportive, and I didn't know what to do with myself. I would go to California and visit a friend, and I wouldn't know how to be. And I finally decided that I was going to start seeing psychics and mediums. And in my mind, I felt, well, you know what? Maybe this isn't true. Maybe these people are rooking me. But at least it's hope. At least it's hope. And I spent thousands of dollars actually going to psychics and mediums. And I would say that most of them did not help in the way that I thought they were going to help, but they helped in another way, in that they did give me hope. That mostly it was in terms of, well, there's another way to be, or even sometimes if they just told me, you're going to be okay, but it's going to take 2 years. That was something I could grab onto and say, like, okay, I'm going to be okay in 2 years, and nobody's going to tell me anything different. And I kept going to psychics for about 6 months, even when I came back to New York where I lived, because that sort of acted to transform me in terms of feeling, I don't want to hear people saying, poor you, or dragging me down to that cursed feeling. I want to feel like, okay, if I had that, I want to change the narrative. And I changed that narrative to, okay, I had this extraordinary relationship for 4 years. I was extraordinarily happy. I can be happy again. And I even dug out statistics that said that women who had been in happy marriages where the person had died were more likely to find happiness again. So that was sort of like my carrot. I thought, okay, I can change, I can do this, I can be okay. And at the same time, I felt, well, whatever I have to do to get through this is okay for me to do. And some of those things were actually not okay, according to a lot of my friends. I mean, I drank, not to the point of being an alcoholic, but, I drank a lot. I took drugs. And I threw myself into a relationship way too soon. But because it was busy work, I told my friends, well, I can't leave, because if I leave, I'm going to have to grieve. But while I'm with this totally inappropriate person, I can get through this. And I did get through it.
Let me interject here for a second, because I want to go back to something you've said.
Okay.
So let's put aside the question of the validity of psychics and those things, because that's another discussion altogether.
Right.
But whatever the source is, whether it's reading your horoscope or going to a reader or finding something in literature for that matter, or finding biblical inspiration, whatever it might be, it's for some people it's their faith, and for some people it's whatever. You were using those elements, not like I believe absolutely every single thing that the psychic said, but finding the hopeful elements and changing the word you used is changing your narrative.
Yes.
Which is changing the story that you're telling yourself about yourself. right?
Right.
Is that how you would describe it?
That's exactly true. And also, when you change your mood, I mean, there's scientific studies that say even when you smile, it has a chemical reaction in your body. And I just found that when I changed my mood, I felt better. And just feeling like, well, you know what? These people are telling me things and it feels good to hear it. And even if I can only believe it for 5 minutes, that feels better. And that's something I can build on.
I attended a class some time ago, and it was on brain science. And the teacher there said, your brain believes whatever you tell it, whether or not it's true.
Yes.
And so if you tell it, I am happy, you claim it as your present thing, or I am capable of whatever I want to do, whatever it is you want to tell your brain says, yeah, okay, I'm in. But if you say, I'm cursed, I'm an unlucky person, your brain believes that, and you operate that way.
Absolutely right.
That sounds like that's exactly what you were kind of rewiring your brain.
I was rewiring my brain. And I found a lot of people gave me books about that, and I would read the books about how you can rewire your brain. And every night I would just say, well, I'm leaving this up to the universe. I'm going to be okay. Whatever I do, I'm going to be okay. I'm going to find love again. And
but you did take a little side trip there, though, into a destructive relationship. Can you say something about that? Because it wasn't like you went, snap, snap, my fiance died, I'm all better, boom.
Oh, no. No, I knew it was a bad idea. I just couldn't handle the grief. I was drowning in it. And I had gone to a grief counselor, and that sort of made it worse. And I was just crying all the time. And I realized I have to do something. And I thought, well, what do I need to do? And I thought, well, I need to be really busy, and I need another relationship. And I knew I could not possibly feel for anybody, but I just thought, well, let's try this out. So I put an ad in at the time there were ads in New York Magazine. And I answered
this is when they were written down with ink.
When they were written down, I met this guy who was a writer, and he seemed very nice. And he very quickly it was very strange because he very quickly became enamored of me and said, you should move in right away. And of course, the rational part of me said, this is not good. But the other part of me said, great, I won't have to be alone. So I moved in with him, and very soon things started to turn because he never raised his voice. He never hit me, but it was this kind of weird emotional abuse where he would say, oh, honey, if only you wouldn't put butter on your baked potato. You were so pretty when I met you because you were so thin. And I mean, I was 105. I was 105. So I was weighing the difference. And I was saying, well, if I don't eat the way he wants me to eat, then he's going to leave me, and then I'm going to have to grieve. So I began to lose more and more weight. He began to monitor my clothes, my friends, it got really bad until my friends literally staged an intervention and said, you look really terrible. You're like skin and bones. We never get to see you. And I knew what I was doing, and I told them the truth, where I said, look, you don't have to worry. I'm not going to marry this guy. And this guy was waking me up at 3 a.m. every night saying, marry me, marry me. And I would say, I'm sleeping. He'd say, no, marry me. Let's get married right tonight. And I said, I'm not going to marry this guy, but I just have to be in this relationship a little while longer because I cannot face the grief. And the thing that finally did it is he went into my computer and he rewrote a chapter of a novel I was writing.
Oh, now that's tantamount to blasphemy for a writer.
Terrible. And I looked at him and said, why did you do this? And he said, I made it funnier, right? And that was when I knew, okay, I have to leave this relationship.
Wait, Caroline, I have to pause you. Because isn't it amazing? It amazes me that he could do all of these controlling, psychologically abusive things, even tipping you into what sounds very much like an eating disorder.
Yeah.
And the thing that tipped you over was him messing with your story.
Yes.
That was the thing. And it was like, that was the thing outside yourself. It sounds as though you still weren't valuing you in the equation.
Right.
But your story was the part of your stories that you were writing.
That's right. It was the worst kind of betrayal, I thought.
Wow.
And of course, the grief came roaring back. And I thought, okay, at least I had 2 years where I didn't have it, and now I have to process it. And I found a really good grief therapist, and she just said, you have to dive into it and feel bad for a while, and then you will come up. And as soon as she said that, that was my mantra, dive and then come up. And it took me a while, but I did come up. And it's not, I want to be specific and say it's not as if I healed the wound of the loss. I mean, I think with a loss like that, you always sort of feel it, but it actually it was the first time I realized that it made me appreciate life more.
Well, it's what you said in what I recorded in your intro, which is that the biggest tragedies can make future happiness even brighter. It's not like the tragedy stops being so dark.
No.
It's just that it's in contrast with lighter things.
Right. And I started to appreciate even a dinner out with friends where we were laughing made me feel better than it ever had. Because I thought, okay, I have connection. And also I began to feel strong because I felt, okay, I got through this. I remember my therapist said, well, there's two ways to go in a tragedy. You can go down the dark road. A lot of people get into drugs and alcohol, or they even commit suicide. Or you can go into the other path where you do the work and you try to incorporate what happened in order to have a happier life for yourself, which is possible.
Well, you just espoused the entire philosophy of the Morning Glory Project right in those two sentences right there. Because that's really the whole point of what I'm doing here, is that I think that so many of my guests have endured unspeakable tragedies or losses or suffered mistakes of their own and that put them in jail or in terrible relationships or whatever it might be. And yet there's something about you Morning Glory people and others like you that is what drives me. It's that how come some people make it? And it sounds like you made some detours and you made some choices that weren't so wise for a period of time.
Right.
But that somehow that little person in you that would stand up to your mom and say, no, it isn't like that.
That's right.
Somehow she was still in there.
Yes.
She was still under all of
that's
that.
right. No, I have a lot of hope. I'm still sort of a Pollyanna of sorts because I find that it makes me a happier person.
Well, I'm going to quibble with you on the Pollyanna thing.
Okay.
If I may.
Yes.
What audacity I have. Because Pollyanna, the reason people use that word is Pollyanna was optimistic. She just ignored bad things. Like they just didn't even exist.
You're right.
And so to be Pollyanna is to be delusional to some degree. And you don't strike me as that. It's not rose-colored glasses. It's just glasses that aren't dark. It's glasses that let you see all of it.
Right.
And that you choose to embrace a healthier, happier, more delightful, optimistic, hopeful path.
Yeah, I do.
Their soapbox is now kicked out from under my own feet.
I like that soapbox.
You like that? You're on that soapbox too. Well, let me switch just a little bit then to your writing. So in Days of Wonder, and see the delight of discovering a 13-book author in her 13th book is I now have 12 more books that I get to enjoy. But in Days of Wonder, what struck me about that as connected to your story is these characters, it's a rotating point of view. There are three main characters, and they endure some unspeakable things. Mm-hmm. They're very complex characters. This is what you'd call like a really, people would call it a beach read in one way, in that it's kind of it's accessible fiction in that way, but it's deep in that the characters are complex and the dilemmas that they're facing are boggy and not easily solved with one conversation that just doesn't happen until the end of the book. It's not a manipulative story in that way. It's so authentic to what these people have gone through. And so can you say a little bit about how you are in these stories, how your story is in these stories?
Yeah, I mean, I've been, my whole life growing up, whenever anything terrible happened, I was always blamed for it. And it was very hard for me. I mean, my sister once went to the hospital with a panic attack. And I remember my mother called me up blaming me for it and saying, it's your fault, it's your fault. And I asked a few questions like, well, did a doctor see her? And my mother said, no, doctor didn't see her yet. She's been sitting there for 2 hours. And I said, if it was a heart attack, she wouldn't be sitting there. And of course, it turned out that it wasn't. It was a panic attack. And I remember my mother said, well, it could have been, and it still would have been your fault. So this whole issue of, what is my fault and what isn't, which for a time, made me feel like, well, I'm always afraid of, people yelling at me or telling me that something is my fault when it isn't. And I started to really work on that and on myself. And I came to realize that, just because somebody says something is your fault does not mean that it is.
So in this story, you have a character accused of something that she may or may not have done. And she lives her life for quite some time feeling guilty and responsible for that thing. That sounds like that's you on the page in some ways, in that it's this feeling of accusation.
It is me on the page. I mean, my husband always laughs because even now I always have initial reticence about asking people for things or approaching people I don't know, because my deepest fear is they're going to scorn me or yell at me or blame me. And my husband keeps saying, you have to get rid of that. That's just not true. And I know that, but that's what I grew up with. And there was always that moment for me of thinking, one side saying, no, it's not your fault. How could it be your fault? And the other side saying, she's probably right. It is my fault. And how do I rectify this? How do I be a better person? And that whole dynamic, I worked really hard to question every time it pops up. And I actually, make myself, question it more and more. But it definitely was part of the book because Ella, the character, she doesn't know if she's guilty or not, but people are telling her she is. People in authority, like my mother, like my sister.
Only in her case, it was like the courts and
It was the courts, it was detectives, it was the police. And it's I was very interested in how do you fight about that? And if you try to fight it by being a better person, what does that mean to be a better person? I mean, Ella still makes mistakes as she's trying to be a better person. But she really does beat herself up. And that was me for a really, really long time.
Well, and then the other element that's on the page, and forgive me if this goes into a political realm that I don't mean it in a huge way, but also one of your characters is somebody who has been banished from extreme religion, in this case, the Hasidic community.
Right.
And I'm mindful that you're writing a story about extreme religion and about Judaism in a time when that's so... We're recording this in June of 2024 when the war in Israel and Gaza is going on and all of that. And to be an author writing about these things, to be a Jewish author writing about these things at this time, I wonder if that entered your experience at all.
Well, when I started writing, I actually started writing this book and it was marinating like 7 years ago. So it was very different. And actually, I was looking at the Judaism and the Hasidic community through a very different lens. My mother had grown up in an Orthodox Jewish family.
Not Hasidic, but Orthodox.
Not Hasidic, just Orthodox. And she walked away from it when her father died, who was a rabbi. But she always really missed that community. And so she existed in this kind of limbo where she felt she never belonged. That was the real issue that I was writing about. Like, what does it mean when you have community and then you lose it? I mean, you mentioned Leah Lax, and when I was interviewing her for the book, and she helped me quite a lot, I asked her, do you miss anything? And the one thing she said was, well, that sense of community, of not being an outsider, of being part of something. And that was the same thing that all the people who were in the Hasidic community told me too, that was the only thing they missed. And since I always felt that I didn't belong, that was the thing that drew me. I was much more interested in community. I mean, I could have been writing about a fundamentalist Christian society as well, because
Right.
I was just interested in how people feel they're part of something, how they feel that they're not part of something. And what if that ends? Any ultra religious community, no matter what it is, there are punishments for leaving the group. And I found that really interesting, that here was this group where you could feel so supported, and then they boot you out if you don't follow the rules.
Well, we such a stark contrast. And that's part of what I loved about your story, Caroline, is that there wasn't any black and white. There were not just evil and good characters here. And even the faith itself, the fact that the character who is no longer in that faith, she doesn't paint it with one brush.
Right.
She recognizes some of the extremeness of it and the harms that did to her. And she deeply misses that unconditional embrace of the community that, well, it's very conditional ultimately, but while you're in it, what feels like that extremely unconditional and somebody constantly looking out for you. And so it lets us know what is appealing about being part of even the most extreme experiences. And I'm not saying that this is, but even you look at cults and people that feel as though they belong,
right?
That it's the connection to community that often we've had several guests here on the Morning Glory Project who have left extreme religion or cult-like experiences. And that's what they say. They say, I felt part of it. Was an embrace.
Exactly. And that's extremely comforting and seductive to have that. And the Hasidic community is extremely comforting.
Yeah.
You don't have money, they'll all gather together and help you. You don't have a wedding dress, no problem. Somebody will make it for you and give it to you.
Well, aren't we all looking for our tribe in some way?
Yeah, that's
right.
Right.
Our group, and tribe is one of those words, of course, it's a Native American term, but that I think that has a broader definition too, that we're all looking for sort of our connection, our affiliations, and all of that.
Yeah.
Well, Caroline, I am delighted to make your acquaintance first in your pages and now with you in person. I'm grateful for that little girl's voice in you that knew that what you were being told was not so.
Yeah, I'm very grateful for it too.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being part of the Morning Glory Project and sharing your story with us.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been it actually has been really helpful for me to talk about all this stuff, because it sort of reinforces everything I think. And I so love the idea of the morning glory, going through rocks to find the light. That's like a perfect metaphor. Perfect.
Well, thank you. Well, we writers look for the metaphors and everything, right? But I have to say, it is a late spring in California, and the morning glories are everywhere right now.
Oh, so I love that.
Very inspiring. Blessings to you, Caroline.
Thank you so much for this conversation.
Well, meeting Caroline Leavitt and meeting her first through her pages and then through our conversations has been such an exciting thing, because it tells me that it reaffirms for me the power of story and the story we tell ourselves about ourselves. The importance of, what we tell ourselves is how we're essentially designing the life that we're going to live. And we have to decide if the furniture that somebody else wants to bequeath to us is the furniture that we want to live with in the houses that we're designing that are ourselves. But to tell yourself, this is not my story. My family says I'm cursed. No, not mine. And in my subsequent conversation with Caroline, after the recording button was off, I was reminded of a story of my own, that I grew up in a troubled household with a very alcoholic and abusive father who had an explosive rage and was dangerous. And I can remember being a little kid and having him raging, and it was so scary because he was big and I was small and he was dangerous. And he was ranting and ranting, and I remember a very vivid moment in my small childhood where I said in my head, or whether a voice said to me, "This is not mine. This is not mine. I don't have to live this way. This was his design for his life. I didn't have to perpetuate that in mine." And it sounds to me as though Caroline had much the same thing. She had family members telling her, "You're cursed. Everything terrible is going to happen. That's the way it's going to be." And she was saying, "No, I get to have it different." And she went to alternative sources to find other message, to tell herself a different story, and as she put it, to change her narrative. That's what we can do. We can change the story we tell ourselves about ourselves and be the designers of our own lives. Wow, I kind of love that. You can find Caroline Leavitt, Leavitt, wherever you find your favorite books. I hope that will be at your local independent bookstore, but it's also available in online sources. Days of Wonder, only her most recent book, and lucky me, I have 12 more to discover. Thanks so much for listening to The Morning Glory and to these extra blooms for the day. I so appreciate your time and hope that you get to tell your story about who you are as you design it, and that helps you to bloom.